Happy Fraud Case Thursday, everybody. Got to be the favorite day of the week when we talk about fraud cases. You know, we're going to be talking about a particularly spicy one today. We're going to talk about Crazy Eddies. Had anybody heard of Crazy Eddies before they saw the video? So, a little bit of background. They actually refer to the fact that it was iconic, like they were everywhere. It was talked about in the video. That is actually not a misnomer. They were only in the tri-state area, which is kind of in the north. They're in the northeast area. They were very, very big there, like 39 stores. But from a cultural perspective, they were as big culturally as basically anything that you could get before the internet age. Just one of the things I remember this randomly. So there was a film with Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah back in 1983 called Splash. It was one of Tom Hanks' first big films. And I won't go into the detail about this, but Daryl Hannah's character doesn't speak English. So she's in the process of learning how to speak English by watching TV. And this is one of the things that she encounters in a department store. So just get a little bit of context for this. Oh, and there's no sound. Great. All right. All right. Well, we're going to do this without the sound then. Okay. I'm not sure what's going on. I probably should have checked this beforehand. I'm curious. Hold on. I'm just curious. Does the sound is up on the computer? That's why. All right. That makes a big difference. All right. We're going to back up. All right. If it still doesn't work, I'm going to be very sad.
You turn it on.
I just unmuted. You guys are far more observant than I am. All right. We'll try 20 and see how that works. That's not enough.
Prices on specially marked items and his enormous inventory. Stereo equipment, video equipment, color TVs, car stereos, CDs, telephone equipment, disco equipment, and professional products. Plus an unbelievable selection of floor samples and demonstrators, all with full manufacturer's warranties and most price at or below cost. It's Crazy Eddie's greatest clearance delivery going on right now with prices that are insane. Crazy.
Yeah. So that was kind of all over the 1980s culture. There was actually a feature of this in this film. This was a later film, but there was actually in Saturday Night Fever, one of the movie that everybody said made John Travolta famous. It was 1977 is in there. I actually did a search on Google. I was saying what films and commercials films and TV shows feature Crazy 80s commercials. And it gave me a list. It was not a very big list. I thought that they were kind of more because I remember seeing it a lot. It may just be that I saw those films multiple times. But one of the films that it said, and I'm pretty sure this is a hallucination, it said Casablanca. All right. Which, if you know anything about Casablanca, that's a 1942 film, and Crazy Eddies did not open until 1969. So I think that's a hallucination on AI. I could be wrong about this. I don't know. I found that a lot funnier because I was actually alive back in the 1900s, the 20th century, the 1900s. Yeah, during that time period. I started thinking about that. I said, everybody's going to find that crazy. And it's like, well, Dr. Barnes, anything that happened before 2000s, we basically assume it was right around the same time, like World War II moon landing, they weren't that far apart, yeah. And the Backstreet Boys right after that, yeah. So anyway, I had way too much fun thinking about all the things that were right next to each other according to a perspective of 2000s culture. But anyway, Crazy Eddies, we're getting off track here. Very, very fascinating case. And I gave you guys a video that was a little bit grainy and a little bit resolution. I thought a lot about this because there's a few more documentaries that were a little bit better, but I wanted to do this for a couple reasons. First of all, Joseph Wells, I already mentioned, was featured in there. He's the founder of the ACFE, the American Certified Fraud Examiners group. The fact that he featured in this was kind of a big deal. I don't think he did this for all of those, but this was a Canadian TV show from the early 2000s called Masterminds. And I remember watching an episode or two. I think I watched this episode previously, and it was very interesting, fascinating, all the things they talked about in there. So that was kind of the reason I wanted to share that. There's definitely some issues with the fact that this is a couple decades old, which we're going to talk about. There's some references now that hit a little bit differently in now that we're in 2026. But talking about some of the information that was shared in there, let's go ahead and get into the context of the case right at it is. So the first thing you want to talk about was a summary of the case and its key parties. All right. The case summary is pretty straightforward. A retail chain starting in the New York area basically defrauds everyone, and everyone is kind of an appropriate term here because anybody who got involved with Crazy Eddie's lost money, unless it was actually no, everyone. We could even argue the people who were the fraudsters kind of lost out on that. But the big key party is going to be Crazy Eddie Antar. And this guy is a fascinating individual, or was a fascinating individual. I think he passed away. So I love the description that they used at the very beginning. It said, larger than life Brooklyn Fonz. Did anybody get that reference? Okay, if you didn't get that reference, what did I always say when you don't get a reference? Look it up. Everybody should have looked that up. So what is a Fonz? Okay. So what is a Fonz? All right. Fonz is actually a specific reference to a TV show from the 1970s and 1980s called Happy Days. Now, has anybody heard of that TV show? That's actually how the director, Ron Howard, everybody's like, oh, yeah, I've heard of him. He's a director. He was actually a TV star back in the 1970s, 80s. He was in this TV show called Happy Days. There's another character named Henry Winkler. Has anybody heard of the actor Henry Winkler? He's been in Adam Sandler films. And so, yeah, he generally plays kind of a nerdy, shy character or kind of an awkward character in those films. You would never guess this, but back in the 1970s, he was the epitome of cool. That's Henry Winkler in the 1970s. He was the Fonz, Arthur Fonzarelli, or Fonzie, as they called him in there. And I can't tell you, growing up in the 70s and 80s, how much everybody wanted to be like Fonzie. All right. So when he actually talks about how this is a Brooklyn Fonz, this was kind of so Happy Days is set in Wisconsin, and he's kind of a guest to Wisconsin. He's visiting. He lives in a basically a bedroom apartment that's above the house of the main cast. And he's kind of the one that goes down and shows them how to do all the cool things in life. But he just never did anything wrong. He was like perfect. You know, Fonzie was just like the epitome of being cool. And so that's what they were saying is that Crazy Eddie was kind of like a Fonz type character. Everybody wanted to be like that, like him, and everybody just kind of admired and respected him. And I can kind of buy into that because again, like I said, I grew up wanting to be like the Fonz. I fell really, really far from that particular tree. Okay, but to be fair, that's Henry Winkler's acting because Henry Winkler, the individual, is nothing like that in reality. But yeah, so Eddie Antar basically is trying to play this character, and he's kind of along the same lines as other people. I think there's comparisons to the people who project reality distortion fields, like Bill Clinton and Steve Jobs were kind of individuals like that. One person that we're probably going to talk about a little bit later in the semester, Elizabeth Holmes. Has everybody heard her name? So Elizabeth Holmes was the CEO of a company called Theranos, which I really want to look at a little bit later on. There's actually been several pieces of media that have been done about her, but they all kind of had the same thing in common is that they could basically make you believe what they told you. It didn't matter how outrageous it was. They could kind of warp the reality around their assertions and their basically what their words. And so he was a very, very good salesman. And that's a very, very interesting point, a compelling issue that we want to talk about a little bit later. But he could kind of convince you that what you were doing was what he wanted you to do was what you wanted to do the entire time. The statement that was made, and I thought that was a particularly profound statement given everything that's transpired, is people want hopes and dreams. We're going to sell them hopes and dreams. All right. So he's the main character. He's kind of our big villain there. But I don't want to let Sam Antar go. Everybody kind of catch Sam Antar. In the documentary, he's kind of played out as a sympathetic character. Having met Sam Antar and talked to Sam Antar, he's a jerk. Okay. But he's a self-professed jerk. I'm not saying that as a spiteful thing. I'm not saying I got him and talked to him and he was a jerk. He was actually very affable when I talked with him. But he basically admitted that he was all kinds of thieves. In fact, the only reason that he's not still a thief is because he's under scrutiny all the time because of the Crazy Eddie scandal. So a little bit of background about him. He actually went to prison and then rehabilitated, so to speak. He actually serves as a white collar informant now. He actually runs a blog called White Collar Fraud, and it's still running today. But he talks a little bit about the background of Crazy Eddies. He also talks about overstock fraud, which I've alluded to this in some other classes. Back in the around 2010, Overstock.com was having all kinds of financial woes, and their auditor was leaving them, and so their auditor actually shouldn't say the auditor left them. They did, but it was because Overstock fired them because they would not issue an unqualified opinion. So they hired another Big Four auditor, which basically said the same thing: we're not going to issue an unqualified opinion. So they fired that auditor and hired another auditor until they got what the opinion they wanted. Sam Antar was there, and he was publishing constantly about how completely blatant violations Overstock.com was going through. So this is a fascinating one if you're interested in it. It's kind of dated, but it's interesting about how he was a whistleblower on something he was completely not associated with. He was just reading the 10K and saying, yeah, this is wrong. I have experience in fraud and this is a fraud. So yeah, fascinating guy. And he's kind of became a character very similar to Frank Abagnale. Now, does anybody get that reference? Okay, sad to watch Catch Me If You Can, another Tom Hanks film. Yeah. So the idea being is that these people were fraudsters and they had so much experience in this area that they kind of turned informant for the FBI and for the other agencies to actually help catch criminals. So you might say that their net good is kind of starting to outweigh their net bad, but this is a real stretch for Frank or for Sam Antar. And then, of course, the Antar family. How did they describe the Antar family in the documentary or in the show?
Moscow. I remember specifically it was Spartak Jewish Goodfellas.
Yeah,
And like
that's actually a very so yeah. Kind of they did a comparison to the mafia. One of the quotes they said is that a family of swindlers. All right, that's not the kind of application that you want to be given to any family, regardless what you are. But they took pride in that. One of the things that's very interesting is even though Crazy Eddie had his own store, is that his father actually had a retail store there. And what did they say about his father's actions with his own retail store?
the same thing.
He was doing the exact same thing to a much smaller scale. He was skimming and they was dividing amongst the family members. So that's how we learned to do this. So keep in mind there was very minimal ethical threshold here. Okay. Now we've talked about this already. We're learning how to commit fraud as a means to actually how to actually capture fraud. What is the one thing, the boundary that prevents everybody in this room from leaving and saying, all right, I'm going to steal everything? It's the ethical threshold. Okay. We've got to have that in place. And this did not exist for this group of individuals. And assuming that you believe in the idea of nurture versus nature, I think it's probably with Sam and Eddie, they kind of grew up in an environment. It was like, yeah, the world's out to get you, so you get them first. That's the idea and the philosophy that we're carrying forward. All right, moving on. Financial impact of the fraud. Did anybody have a good figure for this one? What'd you say, Andrew?
You said around 200 million.
Yeah, I think that was kind of the estimate I was coming up with, the 200 million. The problem is it's sporadic. They give you so many different figures and it jumps around a lot. So I kind of honed in on some issues that we looked at here. So, or that was talked about specifically in there. So with respect to Crazy Eddie, or I should probably say Eddie Antar, because Crazy Eddie's the name of the store, not the name of the individual. But with respect to Eddie Antar, he moved millions of dollars out of the country at various points. And early on, when he was just committing the misappropriation of assets frauds, he moved $11 million with those schemes. Then he actually went when the company went public, he got another $40 million. And then at the end, when he sold off his stock and it was subsequently cashed out, that was another $30 million. So roughly about $80 million moved out of the country if you based on those estimates. Now, that's not a precise estimate because it was uncertain how much of the $40 million he actually moved out of the country. But the other two were given as estimates in the video. Also, with respect to the financial impact of the fraud, there was basically a big inventory impact that was quantified. Now, this was all over the place, and it was really, really hard to quantify where the inventory numbers were. But one of the big identifications were with the hostile takeover. Remember that at the end of the video? Yeah, the end of the video, the Wall Street comes in. It's like, yeah, you guys can't run this company. We're going to run it for you. It's like, we're taking you over. By the way, this is a totally 80s thing. You never hear the term hostile takeover anymore. Back in the 80s, that was kind of the thing, is that company or shareholders would basically give up more than controlling interest. And so you had to rely on the fact that it was diversified enough. If companies could, or entities, organizations could buy more than 50% of the share, then they basically would take over the organization. And oftentimes they'd liquidate it. Now, I think that was what the goal was here, is to take over Crazy Eddie's and liquidate all the assets. Small problem. There were no assets. Okay. That was problem, the hostile takeover, which was a big lawsuit. But they said $80 million of non-existent inventory. Okay. So I'm going to do my requisite. Good job. Yeah. I don't know how you overstate inventory by $80 million, even an organization this large. That's amazing. That's amazing. And then a little bit later on, they said that the indictment resulted in $150 million in fines and restitution. Note that was just criminal action. Okay. That was kind of the recompensation and then the fines associated with that. What were the civil lawsuits totaling? What was the number there? $1 billion, $1 billion. Now, $1 billion, we kind of say, $1 billion, not that big deal. We got people who are multi-billionaires. It's not that big. $1 billion in 1980s terms is quite a bit of money, quite a bit of money. We're talking on the scale of, depending on the factor that you look at, is probably something at least 5 times greater than what we're at right now, given the scale of inflation that we've had over the past 3 decades, 3 to 4 decades. So yeah, a lot going on, a lot going on. I really like some of the quotes that were at the end of the video, and one of the quotes I thought was very apropos here. And I probably should save this for kind of a wrap up, but I do want to make it now because this kind of tells you the scope of the fraud. Even if we can't quantify it, Sam Antar said, and again, don't read a Sam Antar as a sympathetic investor. When he was saying this, it was kind of like, wow, they're trying to make him like he's legitimately sorry. I don't think he is. I think that he's probably that's probably a sociopathic tendency ingrained in the family. Okay, and again, I'm not saying that as to be dismissed as Sam Antar. These are words that came out of his mouth when I were in response to a question I asked him. And so, yeah, Sam Antar said, "We hurt investors, we hurt creditors, we hurt consumers that might have lost their refunds. We hurt people that work for us that have lost their jobs. There are countless other people that got hurt directly or indirectly from the frauds we have committed." That is very, very transparent and very compelling. And I don't think somebody who could actually have sorrow could actually make that statement and just kind of string those words together. I think they would be too crushed by the weight of what they've done. That's something that kind of tells you not only just how the scope of the fraud was, but how willing they were to hurt people without any ramifications. So certainly some implications there. All right, fraud risk factors. What was the pressure? So there were a couple of pressures that I identified here. All right, so the preliminary pressure had to do with Eddie himself. Okay, what did they say about Eddie and his pursuit of greatness? Who did they compare him to? I'll give you a hint. Very, very prominent individual in today's day and age. Donald Trump. Okay, Donald Trump. He wanted to be the next Donald Trump because Donald Trump is a big deal. By the way, for context, so I know everybody's got feelings about Donald Trump, and I'm not trying to dissuade you from the feelings, but I thought it was kind of interesting that they made that comparison in a video that was 20 years old. Because Donald Trump was a big household name in the 1980s and 1990s for his kind of his stranglehold on the New York real estate market. Late 1990s, he lost a lot of his wealth and basically was kind of fading into obscurity. He was still a kind of a well-known name, but he started to grow back into prominence right around the time this video went up. Okay, he basically disappeared for about a period of 6 to 8 years, and then his name started jumping up again in a really big way. Does anybody know why his name jumped up? It was a TV show that he featured on. Not Fear Factor. I wasn't going to, but yeah, it was Apprentice. Okay, so Mark Burnett indirectly caused the Trump presidency because Donald Trump, if he'd not had The Apprentice, would not have been as big a household name. He went on to The Apprentice, and he had this big catchphrase that everybody was like, "You're fired." He said that all the time, and he always did the same thing with the poke of the finger. All right. Now he's a little bit more notorious in different ways, but again, that was it was ironic to me because Donald Trump was not nearly the kind of had the same signal back then as it does now. So it really is kind of a cultural thing because if you think about wanting to be the next Donald Trump, Crazy Eddie didn't want to be the next president. He wanted to have the notoriety and prestige that Donald Trump had over that point in time, which it was massive. It was starting to become very, very big around 2004. And then a little bit later, they talked about the nature of the fraud and something we've talked about, the stringing the frauds together. When you have fraud, perpetuation, and escalation, Joseph Wells said something that kind of resonated that. His quote was, "If you lose money in one year, then you essentially have to double down every year, and the fraud has to get bigger and bigger and bigger." All right. So can I take it from if you don't believe me, which is fine because I tend to fudge things up. I'm getting older and I mess things up. But if you don't believe me, believe the founder of the ACFE. Those are words directly from his mouth. Okay. We've got that on video now. It says, yeah, self-perpetuation and escalation of the frauds. Any other pressures that you all identified? Family, yeah. So family. I also identified that as part of the rationalization. I think that the pressure to try to actually improve on the family is definitely one of those things to note about. So good one. So the ones I identified are exactly the ones you identified. I'm going to check your answers for this, by the way. It was like he's not going to check his answers on. Nah, I'm just going to check and make sure that you did something. All right. Opportunity. So opportunities here. So let's talk about the one that's kind of the overlay. They don't really specifically mention this one, but it's very obvious given the nature of the fraud. How much control do you think Crazy Eddie, or I did that again, Eddie Antar had over his organization? A lot. I think exclusive control over that. And so Yeah, so there was definitely opportunity. I think you could also make the argument that with Sam going into learning about accounting and going into the accounting firm and learning their tricks, that also improved the opportunity because he could actually figure out what's going on. But let's talk about a few things that were referred to in the video. So one of the ones that was kind of big, and this is again a feature of 2004 videos. We had the naive rookie auditors, okay, and there was only one featured in the video, but that's because of the video. So how were they characterized? Obviously, they were kind of clueless and brainless, but there was also something that was alluded to in the video about what was going on. So it was kind of a shy and nerdy male auditor, and he was accompanied by a very attractive worker at Crazy Eddie's. Now, you want to say that can't possibly happen, Dr. Barnes. That's just too much. That's over the top. That absolutely happened. Okay, keep in mind we're talking about 40 years ago, much different culture. So basically, this happened with both male and female auditors. This is actually given. Michael Knapp actually wrote a case debrief on this. So anytime that a new auditor would come in, they would be escorted by somebody of the opposite gender that was very attractive and was trying to cater to their every whim. All right. Now, we know a little bit more about this in this day and age. So we've got things like catfishing and stuff like that. So we know that people who are attractive are not necessarily sort of working in your best interest. But back then, it was just kind of like, I want to do everything I can to appease this individual, all right, to make this person happy. So there comes like a level of trust that comes to it. And again, that does exist to some extent in today's day and age. But yeah, for context, that was kind of the idea is like put a person you can trust. And how do you gauge trust? By their physical attractiveness, which is kind of one of those goals. And you can kind of tell just from the body cues that was given, like there was just an aggressive amount of flirting going on. And that was a weapon that they were using in that particular scenario. So the naive Reiki auditors, they were easily misled. And basically, it's like, okay, got coffee for you. You want to come and talk to me while you drink your coffee? It's like, yeah, I'll leave my work papers right here on the desk so that nothing could possibly happen to them. Goodness gracious. Okay. Yeah, I am gullible. I'm not that gullible. Okay, I'm not that gullible. Also, what was they say about what were they referring to about Wall Street? What was Wall Street's view of the Antar family?
Well,
They're just like, yeah, these are clueless people from Brooklyn who have no idea what's going on. We're going to take them over and take them for everything they're worth. And so opportunity was a whole bunch of people who really had no clue about how scheming these people actually were. So they thought we're going to take the Antars for everything they're worth. And in fact, the Antars took them for everything they're worth. Personally, I mean, depending on your view of Wall Street was kind of a smarmy place back in the 1980s. You may argue it's still a smarmy place, and good on you. But there were definitely people who were trying to take advantage of one another back then, and it was just kind of like, okay, I'm not trying to cheer for the fraudsters, but good job. Yeah, nicely done. Okay, people take advantage of you, and you kind of take advantage of them. So yeah, a lot of opportunities there. I think ultimately it was just kind of again that reality distortion field that Eddie Antar conveyed. He basically made people believe what he told them, and he just had this larger than life persona. What about the rationalization? So there's an easy rationalization, especially with we're talking about the financial statement fraud. There's the idea that Wall Street is full of crooks. Now, is this a pervasive view? It's a pervasive view in this day and age. It was far more pervasive back in the 1980s. You either loved Wall Street or you hated Wall Street. Okay, there was actually a movie called Wall Street. Has anybody ever heard of this film? Yeah, they did not sugarcoat it. They tried to say that we're going to try to take as much money as possible. We don't care what means it was. By the way, Michael Douglas was great in that film. He's great in that film. He said there's one line in there: "Greed for all intents and purposes are good," and that's kind of the characteristic that he conveyed in that film. And so, yeah. But what about the base rationalization? How did we depict the family, the Antar family? What was the word that we used to describe them? Swindlers, okay? If you're a family of swindlers, what's your rationalization threshold? How much rationalization do you need to do anything? It's like, you know what'd be fun to do is steal $1 million. It says, hold my beer. Okay, yeah. If I said, hey, if I go talk to anybody in this class and said, yeah, Tyler, I think you should steal $1 million. Like, well, you're gonna have to give me a really good reason. He just actually thumbs up and he said, yeah, he's gonna have to give me a really good reason for that. And even then, I don't think I'd do it because I worry about fear of reprisal, and it's just not a good thing to do. I have confidence that that's what Tyler would do me if I thought, or would say to me if he did say if I asked him to do that. If it was an Antar sitting in front of me, it'd be kind of like, you know what? I've already done it. I got here early before class so I could take care of that $1 million swindling. Okay. Now, there's a few of in this classroom that may be lower rationalization thresholds. I'm not going to mention any names. Not going to mention names. Maybe the initials BH. I actually wasn't going to say that, but Ben's face just got bright red when I started talking about it. Anyway, never get old, never get old. All right. So what are some primary lessons we can learn from the case? So I just kind of thought about what might have been, and this is going to be a resounding theme for several of these cases we're going to be talking about. Could Eddie Antar have been successful in his own right, even if he'd never committed fraud? Probably. Again, the guy was an incredible salesman. He just had this incredible level of charisma. If he just applied that in an honest way, probably could have been very, very successful over a much longer term, not nearly the explosion they experienced. Paul Weissman, who was the U.S. attorney during the time, or U.S. attorney during the time, said Eddie could have been an extremely successful business and could have gone on to even better things. But anyway, my notes say what could have been ... And I said is irrelevant compared to what in fact was. And then Joseph Wells kind of prefaced that the statement, they were a pack of thieves. He said those. He said they were a pack of thieves. Their whole family was a pack of thieves, and there's no honor among thieves. So it's a little bit trying to change the nature of individuals. It's like, yeah, you do have to be aware that even if people are capable of big things, if it's not in their nature to be honest or forthright, then it's going to be very, very difficult to change that approach, that behavior. And again, I think this is a good example of kind of the nurture philosophy is that Eddie grew up in an environment where everybody's like, they're out to get you, you get them first. And so he basically was just saying doing something that's going to be good in the short term is certainly beneficial as long as it benefits you. So I'm gonna ask you to share your observations here in just a second, but I did want to talk about some other notes that I had. So some observed frauds in the video. So this was a very unique case compared to the ones we're going to talk to, and it didn't just focus on one type of fraud, but it focused on multiple areas of fraud. So, what were some examples of misappropriation of assets? What was the main asset that they were misappropriating? No, I don't think they were misappropriating inventory. Cash, yes. So cash is kind of their misappropriation. So it was basically skimming. I like the quote from very early in the video. How much of the cash sales did they skim?
For everybody.
So it's basically the cash sales were just on a ridiculous scale, And then what else were they were doing with respect to cash, the misappropriation assets? So we say the money laundering with the movement of outside of the country. There's a lot of cash being exchanged. Now, this is a little bit one of those things that's a little bit hard to what's the word, conceptualize in this day and age, simply because we operate so loosely on cash. But cash was king 40 years ago. And so again, bearer instrument, if you possess it, then it's going to be something that's yours. The only thing that can stop you is if you've got cash in an account and the account's shut down. And that Swiss bank account example was one of those ones that just generally didn't happen. Switzerland's very, very neutral with respect to their laws. It took a big fraud scheme for them to say, all right, we'll shut down this $40 million account. Then financial reporting fraud. Now, what asset was kind of their big financial reporting fraud asset? Inventory, okay, completely misrepresenting inventory. So, and it was not even just one direction. It was not just the fictitious inventory, which we talked about was $80 million. They had other inventory schemes as well. They're talking about how he had obsolete inventory and damaged inventory that he basically repackaged in a sealed box. Looked good as new. Somebody comes home and says, "Oh my gosh, this TV doesn't work. They sold me a dud." Kind of return it, and it's like, okay, we'll see if we can fix it. And then they basically probably gave him the same piece of inventory back. Were there any other frauds that were kind of good financial reporting frauds you identified? I had like 4 more or 5 more. I didn't do the math. So what did they say about insurance? Yeah. Eddie had more fires and floods than the Bible. It's a lot of fires and floods. A lot of fires and floods. Okay. Were there any things with respect to employee compensation?
You would give money to Skinner, you give it to his relatives to pay them. Avoid taxing.
It was paying them off the books. Now, why is off the books thing? Okay, Dr. Caden would be proud because you got to pay taxes when you pay out in the books. So you basically pay them in cash. They don't have to actually recognize taxes. Everybody's happier. So yeah, that's what we're going to learn from fraud is that paying people off the books, everybody's just going to be happier except for the U.S. government. And when the U.S. government's not happy, nobody's happy. All right. So good to note. What about income? Were they underreporting income or overreporting income? Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, we're doing both. So before they tried to go public, they were underreporting income. Why? Pay less taxes. Good. Yeah, we got kind of on the same train of paying less taxes. Okay. But when they were trying to go public, miraculously, their income just shot way up. It's like, okay, we were performing well before, but you should see what we were really capable of right here. Okay. So that overreported income. And so that was kind of value inflation to try to misrepresent what their true financial position was. So I did want to talk about something. This is going to be for the people who are graduate accountants in the room. You've heard me talk about this before, but I think it's important to refer to this because we want to make sure. And I think I've talked about it before, but I want to reiterate. Joseph Wells mentioned that there was inflation of inventory amounts, right? And he basically kind of, I think he was cut off. He probably went to a technical explanation, but just said fictitious inventory boost assets. That subsequently boosts income. Why does that boost income? So again, this is kind of the accounting explanation. It doesn't make sense unless you really understand how the financial statements work. So let's just go and do a remedial explanation. All right. So what are the two items that contribute to gross profit in an income statement? So gross profit is kind of what something that flows down into income. And you can answer this if you're an accountant as well. So what are the two items that contribute to gross profit? Revenues minus cost of goods sold. Okay. So sales minus the cost of those sales. All right. Now, in the calculation of cost of goods sold, one of the final items that's included is ending inventory. Ending inventory is subtracted from the calculation of cost of goods sold. So if you increase your ending inventory, what does that do to your result? Makes it lower, makes it smaller. Okay. So revenues minus cost of goods sold gets smaller. What happens to gross profit? It gets larger, and that makes the bottom line get larger, which is an old accounting trick, but it's one of those things that unless you're familiar with accounting, it doesn't make sense. Okay. So that's kind of the routine explanation. When you hear inventory inflation, you should think, okay, they're trying to increase the bottom line. Again, the way that translates is not particularly perfect. I'm not going to go into much more detail, but you should think when you hear inventory inflation, it's trying to increase their income for that period. And unfortunately, it's a scheme that has to be perpetuated in much greater quantities. As Joseph Wells said later on, it says it basically had to be scaling from year to year to actually maintain that. Interestingly enough, the stock market value at the IPO was $8. What was the eventual stock market value? Around $80. Okay. I think the figures eventually stabilized around $75 per share. So their stock market value increased by 10 times. That's a pretty impressive inflation right there, which no wonder Eddie Antar was able to cash out for $40 million. And then the last kind of comment I wanted to make is that you can tell this video is several decades old because some of the narrative, particularly from the Howard Sirota guy, who's the kind of gray-haired guy who kind of sounded like he's from the New York area, that would not fly in a modern documentary. I thought that the interesting discussion about Debbie 2 and his discussion about the second, the mistress that was also named Debbie, and then the discussion of Crazy Eddie Antar's arrest. I almost did not share this documentary because I was like, oh my gosh, that is so inappropriate. But then I thought, these are people in their 20s. They've probably seen a lot worse than this. Okay. So yeah, but that's one of those things that I was like, if you ignore that part, the documentary is good, but that part was just kind of like, oh my gosh, that is so 2000s and not 2020s. Okay. Any other observations or comments that you all had on this particular item? Anything you found interesting or insightful? Can't believe it. I covered it all. Oh, okay. What you got, Jake?
Just this is another case of like a fraudster's personality probably being what eventually gets them caught, like their greed. Well, same with the greed at Cromwell.
Yeah. So yeah, again, the whole idea that he wanted to be bigger than Donald Trump is kind of like, if he just kind of scaled it back the fraud a little bit, then he might have gotten away with it because there was really very little scrutiny. And if he had realized that the scrutiny that existed could have been bypassed by just a little bit of due caution and care. So again, the same lesson that I teach you all: if you're going to become fraudsters, be careful, fraudsters. Okay, that's I'm going to put that in learning objectives for next year. All right. What else? What you got, Mary?
They did the takeover. He fled to Israel, 6 passports, and abandoned Sam.
Yeah. That's that again. The no honor among thieves is like, yeah, I'm going to put you through college. So thanks. You're the greatest brother or greatest cousin ever. Okay. I've been caught. I'm going to Israel. You're on your own. It's like, oh, great. You're the greatest cousin ever. Yeah. I don't know if a family member did that to me. I'm not sure how I'd feel about it. But again, Sam probably was like, you know what? That's fair. I would have done the same thing if I'd had the opportunity. Yeah. It was also very interesting. So just for context, when I talked to Sam Antar, this is not just me having a one-on-one interview. That would have been great. I would have loved that. But it was actually a research conference when I was at my PhD program at Oklahoma State. And so this is a very professional environment where he was kind of a keynote speaker and he was presenting to a room full of really well-known accounting scholars. Can you imagine what his presentation was like? Do you think he was very, very much like, okay, very button and tie, very using very formal language? No, he was dropping expletives like there was no tomorrow. Okay. I didn't count how many times he dropped the F-bomb, but it was in the dozens. Okay. It was rigorous. And he was very entertaining and very interesting. But I got to imagine some of the people who were old school accounts like, this is so inappropriate. Yeah. So yeah, very interesting individual. Any others observations? All right. Well, I guess it's time for a quiz then. Okay. So